first saw his first airplane. I'll wait to put it on tape, but he saw his first airplane when he was 11.
Okay.
So that's more of his boyhood.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let's go back. Let's go back to his boyhood.
Okay.
Your father's boyhood, and when he first developed an interest in airplanes.
Okay. What happened is he was around 11 years old, and the first airplane was flying over the city of Lynchburg, Virginia, and his mother said, "Woogie, Woogie." They called my father Woogie. That was his nickname. They said, "Woogie, Woogie, look up, look up." And so Woogie looked up and saw his first airplane flying over the house in Lynchburg, Virginia. And so he went to his father and he said, "I want to be a pilot." And so my father said, "Let's go out to the airport and talk to the guys out there." So Edward Spencer takes Chauncey Spencer out to the airport. And so they go to the airport, and it's Preston Glenn Airport in Lynchburg, Virginia. And they said, the guys in there, the manager of the airport says yes. And he does. My father said, the man didn't even look up at him. And so my grandfather, Edward, says, "This is my son, and he wants to learn how to fly." And so the man says, "We don't teach colored to fly. They don't have the intelligence." And so my father left, and he was pissed. And he left, and so that was the bug that he got, that he was determined to be a pilot. And so he continued on and finished his education and became a social worker. Yes, sir.
This is about 1912 then.
That's correct.
1912.
Yeah, flight started in 1903.
Yeah. So, and since you're a sort of a aviation historian here, were there any black pilots flying in that you know of?
Yes, 1909.
Okay.
1909, Peters, where they found one out of North Carolina. There's a book on it called Blue Skies, Black Wings.
Okay.
And he was flying.
And what was his name? Peters?
Peters.
You know his first name?
I do not, but I have his book.
Yeah.
And the name of the book is called Blue Skies, Black Wings.
But your father didn't know anything about him then, right?
No, not in 1909, because he would have only been 3 years old.
1909.
Yep, and nor did anybody else, by the way. Because our history as African Americans in this country, which I only use that because that's politically correct in order to describe ourselves at this time, is that our history wasn't being recorded, nor was it being paid attention to, because if we go back, I mean, we didn't even have birth certificates that were accurate. And most of us were not born in a hospital. They were born by a midwife or in a house. So there is no real records.
Okay. So we had people flying at least by 1909.
That's correct.
And a flight was invented in 1903.
That's correct.
And I've thought about this, and we've interviewed a lot of Tuskegee Airmen. As I reflect on how people talk about the era of, the whole idea of flight in the early part of the 20th century, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it was seen as a cutting edge adventure that defined your humanity on some level. If you were a modern person, you could fly.
I agree.
Yeah.
And it was. It was the door to technology. It was the door to tomorrow. Mm-hmm. In Black Wings that William Powell writes in the 1930s, the first book, Black Wings, it was to encourage the young black African American males to get involved in aviation because that's where industry was moving to. And we're still behind, and the answers are on the board, and they still don't seem to read them. They still have their pants drooped down. They still don't seem to be determined nor self-driven, and the answers have been here since we've been here.
Okay, but to be fair, our pants are drooping now, but they weren't drooping in 19.
No, I'm telling you how much progression that we've had then, and the generation then that had progressed, and how reversing the progression has happened to now the 21st century.
So you would say, in reflection on what's going on now, that young black males are not excited about technology the way they were excited.
Can I help and make a comment? Okay. They're not representing themselves as the ancestors and the shoulders that they stand on.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, all right. So your father, who's known as Woogie, then he saw his first plane. He wanted to fly, but it was told that colored people weren't as intelligent enough to fly.
That's correct.
Okay. So what did he do?
So he continued on, and he continued on in his life, and as a boy, and he's done a lot of things. He worked at a drugstore, delivering. At that time, it was Prohibition, delivering liquor and stuff to the chief of police, to the mayor and their guests in the red light zone, prostitution areas. My father's a real man. He's been places where we can say that other people say that they read about it and he's been there. And that's where I get a lot of my history and my strength. It's because it's a living piece of lesson that I've been given. And he continued on, and he became a professional, graduated and became a social worker. Married. The marriage didn't last long. There was no children that I know of through that marriage. And he married Elvira Jackson. And that marriage didn't last long. And he continued on as a social worker, but he wasn't happy as a social worker. He still wanted to fly. So there were very prominent people that came to my grandparents' home, Edward and Ann Spencer's home. And one of those individuals was Vernon Johns, the Reverend Vernon Johns. And Vernon Johns brought a congressional member by the name of Oscar the Priest through Lynchburg, and they stopped off at the Ann Spencer home.
Now, let's just chew on this for a moment. Vernon Johns, he's the great Vernon Johns, and great genius Vernon Johns, who could quote Shakespeare off the top of his head and Bible verses, and whose daughter Barbara Johns protested the segregation policies of the state of Virginia in the 50s, and who was pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, prior to Dr. King.
You took my fire. You're absolutely correct.
Now, this is the
You're absolutely correct. And that school was Prince Edward County. And Brown versus School Board.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. You know your history. I thank you.
So Dr. King, the stage was set for him, and people started discovering this, when they really started digging into the history. The Vernon Johns set the tone for Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott and all that.
That's correct. And he also, may I add on to your history, that he carried him to the church. He was the first, he carried him to that church, the Dexter Baptist Church. And on their way there, they stopped off at the Ann Spencer house. And in this play I told you about that my sister put together, that they show that. They don't say anything about Vernon Johns, but that's the first time that Martin Luther King met Ann Spencer. And that's where he learned about A. Philip Randolph, because A. Philip Randolph actually made the first move on Roosevelt. Protesting the lack of concern for Negroes, and that's when the Executive Order 8802 comes out, Fair Employment Act, that Roosevelt said he's going to put a chicken on every table and a car in every driveway. And we changed from voting as African Americans for Republicans up to Abraham Lincoln, and we switched over, and the first African American that we support, I'm not African American we support, but the first person we support is African American, a Democrat, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's what changed the whole town. And Oscar the Priest, by the way, was a Republican. And it was Mitchell who became in his part and knocked him out of the box, because it was Mitchell who was a Democrat. And then it was proper and in our community of African Americans to support Democrats because they were the working class of people.
Yeah. I think eventually William Dawson became a big Democrat in Chicago.
That's correct. And he's in my father's book, by the way.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, that's it. That's you giving a history. Oscar D. Priest, 6'5".
That's right.
Rooster haircut, and so he's the one that talks to your father about coming to Chicago.
No, Oscar the Priest. Yes, I apologize. Yes, Oscar the Priest is one. What he didn't talk to my father. My father walked through the sunroom, and so Oscar the Priest says, "Ed, who's that?" And so Ed says, "That's my son." He said, "Well, what's he doing?" "Well, he's a social worker, but he wants to fly." So Oscar the Priest says, "Well, send him out to Chicago. We got Johnny Robinson out there, and Cornelius Coffey, and Willa Brown, and Dale White, and they're doing a tremendous job out there." And so shortly after that, he resigned his position, and he packed up, filed his divorce, and he moved to Chicago. And he went to Chicago with $900 that his father had given him. And he went to Johnny Robinson's. Well, first, I take that back. He went to Dr. Earl Renfro's office, who was a dentist, and he was a certified pilot with a rating to teach. And
this is a black doctor.
Yeah, Earl Renfro. I'm going to have his picture, too. I'm going to show you his picture. Okay. Earl Renfro was a dentist, and I don't want to jump around here, but I want to tell you a little connection with Earl Renfro. Earl Renfro is where where Oscar the Priest told my father to make his first contact. So when my father got to Chicago, he goes to Oscar the Priest's office. Well, politics are not treating Oscar the Priest that well around 1933, because we know that Roosevelt became president in 1932. So the Democrats took over the White House. So Oscar the Priest says, "Well, why don't you go see Johnny Robinson?" Well, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. "Why don't you go see Dr. Renfro?" And so Earl Renfro says, "Well, why don't you go see Johnny Robinson? They got a thing going on." So my father said he went to Johnny Robinson's garage, and he said he didn't see anything in that garage that looked like an airplane. But Johnny Robinson wanted to get that $900, but my father just wouldn't give it up. So he left there and he went back to Earl Renfro's office. And Earl Renfro says, while he was in the office, there was a man sitting over in the corner working on a radio airplane engine. And so my father's standing there waiting for Earl Renfro. And so he says to the gentleman, he says, "Hi, my name is Chauncey Spencer, and I'm from Lynchburg, Virginia, and I want to learn how to fly." And he says, "Well, hi, my name is Dale White. Good to meet you." And that's how Chauncey Spencer and Dale White become the best of the best. My father said he never had a brother, but Dale was his brother. Yeah. And they became the best. From that first meeting, they never separated, and Dale White died in 1977 in December, and they never parted until their death. And if you go to Dayton, Ohio, in the cemetery where Dale White is buried, Dale White Sr., they have a picture of the plane, Old Faithful, and on one side is Chauncey Spencer looking up in the air, and on the other side is Dale White looking up in the air, and it's built on the tombstone.
So Dale White lived the balance of his life in Dayton?
He did.
Okay.
He did, and his grandkids are there now. His wife died recently, not recently, but a while back, but that's where they stayed all the time. Yep. And there's a history about that. I mean, I could take you on for days on these stories. But Dale White, let me just give you something on Dale White. I have to say something for him. Is that Dale White was the first African-American mechanic, aviator mechanic that was hired at Patterson Field, later on Wright-Patterson, and he retired from Patterson Field 38 years later. And by the way, Wilbur Forrest, he taught young African-Americans how to fly in summer programs. He's created his own summer programs. Dale White Sr. did. And his son is an educator, now retired in the media, which we would call a librarian. And he's retired, and he and his wife travel, and his wife writes different stories on Ann Spencer and other African icons for children's books.
Well, what's her name?
I don't know her name.
Okay, all right.
God forgive me. I know Dale's name.
Okay. All right. So, wow. So, so this is getting deeper now. So he meets Dale White.
Yes.
And now Johnny Robinson, was that the brown condor they called him?
They called him the brown condor later on. After, see, Johnny Robinson, what he did, he and Cornelius Coffey, they taught themselves how to fly. But Johnny Robinson was more flamboyant, more aggressive, and Johnny Robinson was the business style of the organization between Coffey and Johnny Robinson. So Johnny Robinson and Coffey weren't able to get people to support them financially for their dreams to fly. So Coffey says to Robinson, "Why don't you contact the embassy in New York? Because Haile Selassie needs somebody to start his Air Force in Ethiopia." So Mussolini was getting ready to attack Ethiopia, which we know he did. And so Johnny Robinson went there. But interesting enough, let me tell you this. Before Johnny Robinson got there, there was a very flamboyant name, Herbert Julian, who had come from Trinidad. And he was there, and he had his spyglass on, and he dressed to the T.
Yeah, the monocle.
The monocle, thank you.
The high boots.
The high boots, the whole 9 yards. He dressed like he was straight out of Hollywood's magazines.
He's the one we were talking about earlier that appeared on the Dick Cavett show
That's
in the 70s when he was in his 90s, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's him.
Julian, yeah.
Yeah, but
Herbert Julian.
Well, Herbert Julian.
The Black Eagle.
The Black Eagle, and he got the name the Black Eagle of Harlem. And it wasn't until he landed in Harlem, New York. But what happened on that, and there's a little story on that. Well, first of all, everything I'm telling you, I have actual interviews of all these people making these comments that I can make, that I can back up right out of their own voices. And Coffey says that when Johnny got down to Ethiopia, Julian was still there, but they wanted to send him away. And so they had a fight. Johnny Robinson and Herbert Julian had a fist fight while they were down in Ethiopia. Yes. And this is information that I got straight from Cornelius Coffey. And so anyway.
So the Black Eagle and the brown condor
and the brown condor,
are
they tangled.
Slugging it out.
That's right.
In Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And so who eventually prevails here?
Johnny Robinson.
Okay.
Johnny Robinson. Herbert Julian comes back and tries to join in with the organization called the National Airmen Association of America, which I haven't told you anything about yet. And they're smart enough not to let him in. He was the kind of individual, he was very flamboyant, and there's nothing negative about my comments. Some of us are more opportunists than others. And I'll leave it to the people's thoughts from there.
Yeah, it sounds like the names even these guys are using these are adventurers in a lot of these fellas are true adventurers, and I guess our generation is raised up watching cowboy movies, as that being the frontier. But at the generation before us, the aviation was the frontier.
That's right. They had to make their own movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it's amazing. Okay, so brown condor slugs it out with a black eagle.
That's right.
And so Johnny Robinson, who's from the Gulf, I think from Gulfport or Biloxi. I'm not sure now. I think it's Gulfport,
okay,
Mississippi originally, and they honor him down there. He becomes the Air Force, basically, for Haile Selassie,
that's right,
Emperor of Ethiopia.
With 3 airplanes.
With 3 airplanes.
And he had the Junkard airplanes when he flew. And he continued to stay down. He died over in Ethiopia in a plane crash in 1955. He came back after Italy took over Ethiopia during Hitler's time. He came back to the States in 1936 and was welcomed back. And then after we got in the war and then Ethiopia was freed, Johnny Robinson went back and lived the rest of his life in Ethiopia.
Okay, quite a story.
Yes, that's one by itself. There's so much, there's so much that should be put on the television about our own history that our children would be so interested in, because I'm interested in it because it's like, wow, I didn't know that. And I didn't know that. And then you see how things are so possible as you realize history is only one touch away.
Yeah. In your case, you're genetically linked directly to someone who live in this kind of exciting life.
It's scary sometimes, but sometimes you want to dress up like that and want to know why. But hey, it's because that's who you are.
Now, the field that they flew out of in Chicago, and this is the field that was in Oak Lawn,
Illinois.
This was Coffey Field, right?
No, it was called Harlem Airport.
Harlem Airport. All right. And wasn't there something called Coffey Field?
There's a Coffey Fix, and Midway has a runway named after Coffey Fix, named after Cornelius Coffey. Okay. There's also a heater that's used on some of the Cessna airplanes to keep your fuel from freezing that Coffey invented and has a patent on. But it's called the Coffey Fix. If you ever land at Midway, there's a runway there named after Cornelius Coffey called Coffey Fix. Okay. And you can Google all this stuff that I'm telling you with his name, and you'll get a ton of information.
Okay. Now, you didn't mention, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but Bessie Coleman was very celebrated in Chicago. She's really celebrated in Chicago. There are things named for her. How does she fit into this story?
She fits in the story because she was a icon. Can I go back a little bit? Let me tell you, because I want to do it properly. Chauncey Spencer in the National Airmen's Association group, they respect the shoulders that they stood on. So I'd like to take you back to the first African Americans that we recognize in aviation, which would be 1917, Eugene Bullard. Eugene Bullard was from Columbus, Georgia, and he hitchhiked his way to Norfolk, Virginia, got on a steamship and went over to Ireland. And from Ireland, he found his way over into Paris. And he was a junior amateur boxer. He later on found out about the French Air Force, and he joined. He joined as an infantry person, and he wore the infantry uniform 170. He took pilot license. He got pilot license, took flight training, got pilot license, and he was the only African American to fight for this country over in France as a pilot. And he became a ace, had 3 kills, and he called his plane the Black Swallow of Death. And that's Eugene Bullard. So let's move on from 1970.
Wait a minute now. Okay. Now let's just a little bit more about him. The Black Swallow of Death.
That's correct.
And all right.
And he says on his plane, all blood runs red.
Now, Eugene Bullard, did he fly for the, I know he's an American who goes over to...
He flew for the French.
He flew directly for the French. Right?
That's correct. We didn't see...
What's confusing for a lot of people is that when the Black American troops who were actually recruited here in this country for the United States Army, when they went overseas, they were often assigned to the French Army.
Right.
Instead of the American Army, because the American Army didn't be bothered trying to supervise black people.
Right. They call them regiments, actually. Yeah. My father was part of that. Mm-hmm. The Chicago regiment my father came from was called the 8th Regiment.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And William Powell and them but I haven't got to him. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. Well, in his case, no, he fought for the French. And he's buried in Flushing, New York with the French. Eugene Bullard is. Eugene Bullard never got any recognition from the United States government for doing anything.
And how did he meet his demise?
He met his demise, I believe, I don't know if it was a heart attack or what, but he died in the United States. He was an elevator operator at the Rockefeller Center.
So he survived the war?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he survived World War I, and he was a spy in World War II because he married a duchess and had a nightclub in Paris. And the Germans would come in there and they would talk about this and that, and they didn't realize that he could translate. So he was sending information back, and when they got information, they had to smuggle him out of Paris and into Spain. And from Spain, he had to take his 2 daughters and leave his wife, his duchess, who was a duchess, and he left his wife over there. And his daughters are still alive, I'm sure, and probably live somewhere in New York City. My father used to stay in touch with him.
Well, that's quite a story. I've heard his name and I've heard bits and pieces of the story, but just this brief. This is a movie.
It's a movie.
Eugene Bullard.
It's a movie. Larry, it is a movie.
All right, next. You said next we're going on.
Okay, next we're going to move on to Herbert Julian. Herbert Julian was flying in 1919, and he flew from Trinidad in through Canada and into New York City and landed in Harlem and was given the name the Black Eagle.
Well, a parachute landed
in Harlem Avenue.
The streets of
That's right.
Harlem.
That's right. And guess where the airplane went? Who knows? I'm just thinking to myself, there was no co-pilot in there. Where the heck is the airplane at? If he pails out, where'd that airplane go?
That's a good question.
It had to go somewhere in the Hudson, okay? I'm not sure, okay? And those are the details that...
Are you sure he didn't have somebody flying?
He might have, and I may be wrong on that one, okay?
Right.
And I don't know, but as crazy as they were back then, there was no stunts. They were real live actions, okay?
So this is something that I've seen in the papers and the old papers and stuff that him, the Black Eagle, Herbert Julian, and we just talked about his attempt to form the Ethiopian Air Force and conflict with Johnny Robinson.
That's correct.
The brown condor.
That's right.
So condor versus eagle, and Herbert Julian appears many years later in the 1970s on the Dick Cavett show.
That's right. That's right. And well, he was a not an ombudsman. What are they instead of city council people in New York, where they're heads of the boroughs?
Borough president.
Okay, he was a borough president, and I want to say Brooklyn. Okay, but he was politically connected in New York local government, and he died in 1977. That I do know. Herbert Julian had one of the aviation organizations like the National Airmen Association, Bessie Coleman Aerial Club. New York's location was Herbert Julian, and he chose New York, and he stayed in New York. If you have time before you leave, I'll show you a small movie about when he comes back from Ethiopia, and they're interviewing him while he's wearing his full-length mink coat and his mink hat, and he talks about it in his flamboyant way. Very interesting character.
So, what's the name of that movie? Is it available to you?
I don't know, but I'll share it with you. And I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you some stuff to take back.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a DVD of an interview with my father, Placed in the Sky. I'm going to give you a story of Willa Brown. And in there, I can give you the story, and I get you a copy of where Coffey talks about the fight that they had between the two individuals, so you won't hear it from me. You're going to actually hear it from him. And in there is a little setting. I'll tell you what, Ozzie Davis narrates it, so it is available. And there's a bit in there about Herbert Julian.
Okay, so yeah. Herbert Julian. Okay, now, we started talking about these when I mentioned Bessie Coleman. Does she fit in here anywhere?
Yes, Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman got her inspiration from Eugene Bullard. Bessie Coleman had 2 brothers, and they were both in World War I. They were part of the 8th Regiment out of Chicago. They were infantry. And so Bessie Coleman was born in Texas, and Atlanta, Texas, as a matter of fact. And her father was an Indian and had lived in Oklahoma. They left the Indian reservation and they tried to make it in Texas. Well, the 2 brothers left and they settled in Chicago. So Bessie Coleman came to live with her 2 brothers in Chicago. That's how Bessie Coleman gets to Chicago, from Atlanta, Texas to Chicago. While she was there, Bessie Coleman held several different jobs. She was a lion tamer. She was a manicurist. She was called The Beast Bessie. She had a variety of backgrounds, and aviation was a thing. She was idolized by Harriet Quimby. Harriet Quimby was flying in 1911. She was a white pilot, white female, and that's who inspired her on the female side. She had heard of this Eugene Bullard from Robert Abbott, who was the founder and editor of the Chicago Defender. And he told Bessie Coleman, if you're really serious about flying, you need to learn how to speak French because you'll have to go over to France. Well, Bessie Coleman learned how to speak French. And she saved her money, and Robert Abbott assisted her and sent her to France, where she got her pilot license and learned how to fly. And learned the story of Eugene Bullard and how the things that set him back didn't hold him back. And so that's where Bessie Coleman comes as an idol. Then after we leave Bessie Coleman, then we go to William Powell. William Powell wrote the book Black Wings, and it was about inspiring and encouraging young African American males to get involved in aviation at the ground floor. Because if they didn't get in the ground floor, they would be left out. And that is quoted by his sister, William Powell's sister, on an interview that I also have in my files.
Okay, now the book Black Wings, was that an old book?
That's right.
A book that was written back in the
1930s.
1930s.
That's correct. And Black Wings, the name that was used by the Smithsonian, and their book Black Wings is the second. Has nothing in relationship to that because it talks about black wings. It talks more about the things that have been accomplished up until the time the Smithsonian had black wings, which was 1996, and this was done in the 1930s. This was done right after the Depression, and the Black Wings was part of an encouragement because blacks had jobs during the war, like all of us did. And then after the war, aviation became something for a novelist. And then Los Angeles was a big warehouse or junkyard of airplanes. So that's where all the junket airplanes and the biplanes and stuff like that, they were in Los Angeles because Los Angeles was one of the locations that they were building airplanes for World War I and then World War II. Because the airplane came in the middle of World War I, where they would just fly over and throw a bomb outside of the window. They didn't have anything sophisticated. And that's how they flew. So it was William Powell. So William Powell then puts wings back on Bessie Coleman by starting in 1928 the Bessie Coleman Aerial Club. And at that time, now
Bessie Coleman, didn't she die in a
She dies.
plane
Okay, I'm
crash?
sorry. Bessie Coleman dies in Jacksonville, Florida, while her manager and her are flying. And what they're doing is they bought an airplane, a Jenny from Texas, and the manager flew the airplane to Jacksonville, Florida, where she was supposed to put on a show. Well, supposedly, and this has been quoted by her nephew, which I record also, that she was flying, looking around at the area where she was going to be putting the show on, and she didn't have her seatbelt fastened, nor did she have a parachute on. And she was flipped out of the airplane. And she died. And meanwhile, the manager, he rolled the airplane down to the ground and never parachuted out, never jumped out, and he died in the crash of the airplane. And it was talk that my father had told me that an individual ran out to the airplane to see if they could help them and was smoking and threw a cigarette down to help them, and not realizing that the fuel was all over and this airplane has been burned up. So I don't know how we can use forensics now, and it's too late because the evidence is gone. But with forensics as we have it today, that would have been able to show us at least evidence on if there was any foul play within the mechanics of the airplane. So that's something that we can keep in our own minds, but there's no facts to prove whether it was or was not. So but that's how Bessie Coleman died. She dies in, I want to say 1923.
1923.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're going to pause right here.
Okay.